Today it's impossible to say who first invented the prison and when it happened. In any case, it happened a very long time ago, at the very dawn of human history. Even the ancient Greek myths from the time of the Trojan War and the books of the Old Testament are full of descriptions of dungeons and imprisonments. However, for centuries humanity misused prisons. Imprisonment was not seen as a punishment as it is today. Our ancestors genuinely did not understand why it was necessary to build a good and sturdy facility, fill it with criminals, then guard them around the clock, as well as feed them, treat them, and heat the place. After all, it's much simpler to hang a criminal in the central square, or in the worst case, cut off his hand. And you could even make money off him, for example, by selling him into slavery on the galleys. It is believed that the modern concept of imprisonment was born at the end of the 18th century under the influence of humanistic ideas that a person can cleanse his soul and become a useful member of society. However, its foundation was laid earlier, in the dark and grim times of the Middle Ages. In this episode, I will talk about the most famous medieval prisons, their daily life, and their rules. Do you know what could get you thrown into prison in the Middle Ages and what life was like for their inmates? Did they have sentences, and was it possible to get early release? My name is Semyon and I'm kicking off How They Lived. Let's begin. Subtitle editor. Places of confinement existed even in ancient times, but they were dungeons, not prisons. For example, in ancient Greece, they were used to punish debtors and for the preliminary punishment of criminals. Prisoners in Athens had much more freedom. They could receive visitors, and if someone stood surety for them, they could even be released. The total number of prisons in ancient Greece was relatively small. Prisons were used more widely in ancient times. Usually, criminals for whom the death penalty was considered too severe a punishment ended up there. However, due to the lack of a proper legal framework, there were many abuses. A person could be imprisoned for an indefinite period. The conditions for prisoners in Roman prisons depended greatly on their status and financial situation. The wealthy served their sentences in relatively comfortable conditions, while the poor had a hard time behind bars. The early Middle Ages did not have prisons in the modern sense of the word. But what about all those stories of gloomy dungeons or princesses locked in grim towers, you might ask? All of that existed, but it had nothing to do with the penal system. A king or a feudal lord could throw a person into a dungeon simply whenever he wanted. This was often done to political opponents, debtors, and prisoners taken on the battlefield. Historians call this type of imprisonment lordly captivity because most often it was important and noble people who ended up there. Serfs were generally not kept in dungeons and castles. The terms and conditions of imprisonment for such prisoners were not regulated in any way and depended entirely on the goodwill of the person who put them in the dungeon. For example, war criminals were usually kept in normal conditions, and after receiving a ransom, they were released. But some claimant to the throne, who turned out to be politically inconvenient, could spend decades in the dungeon or might never leave it at all. The church was no different from secular rulers. As early as the 4th century, there were cases when priests or monks who had committed offenses were confined in basement rooms or cells. Later, the clergy gained the ability to do the same with lay people, creating something like prisons on the grounds of monasteries. In the Middle Ages, members of the nobility were often forced into monastic life. This applied to both men and women. This can be compared to modern life imprisonment, but the alternative to taking the tonsure was usually death. We know little about the lives of monastic prisoners, but their conditions and treatment were hardly luxurious. In Europe, there were so-called houses of correction, where beggars, vagrants, loose women, and petty criminals were placed. Those truly were hell on earth because the conditions there were truly terrible. Houses of correction were always overcrowded. Epidemics and murders happened there regularly, and the death rate among inmates was off the charts. Prison as a form of punishment. Modern-style prisons appeared in large medieval cities, and this happened quite late, during the period when these cities themselves became important political and economic centers of Western Europe. For most people, the Middle Ages is a rather grim historical period, and a medieval prison is basically seen as hell on earth. This is nothing more than a stereotype that came into popular culture from books, movies, and computer games. In reality, things were different. Prison conditions depended on the specific prison, the sentence, and the social status of the inmate. The birthplace of the prison as we know it is considered to be medieval Florence. The first such institution was the Stinche prison, also known as Stinche Island. Its history begins in the 12th century when Italy was in the midst of an irreconcilable struggle between two political parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. I won't go into the reasons for this conflict. What's important is that after the Guelphs' victory, they built a special prison for their opponents, the very same Stinche prison. However, over time, other inmates began to appear within its walls as well. Prisoners were sent to the Stinche prison only by court order. Most often it was debtors and bankrupts, duel enthusiasts and gamblers who ended up here. Domestic abusers were also sent behind bars. In such cases, judges used the phrase pro amendare, which can be translated as for correction or for reformative purposes. Overall, it can be said that imprisonment in Florence was given for minor offenses. For more serious offenses, people were whipped, branded, deprived of limbs, or simply executed. In medieval Italy, a person who had served time in prison was not considered an outcast. As a rule, he could soon be released by paying a fine to the treasury. The Stinche prison building itself. It resembled a huge stone cube, divided into 7 sections, the old and new prisons, cells for wealthy prisoners on the upper floors, a women's block, dungeons for the commoners below, an infirmary, and a basement for the insane. The institution employed several staff members, a doctor, a secretary, and several priests. The job was considered not particularly demanding and even honorable. By the way, the residents of Florence themselves were proud of it, as it was a testament to the city's wealth. Later, municipal prisons began to appear in other cities of Italy as well. The conditions in them were quite decent, especially for prisoners who had money. For example, in Bologna, the inmates of the local prison were even allowed to visit their families on the biggest holidays. And in years of famine, they were sent to beg for alms. In medieval London, there were several prisons, the most famous of which were Newgate, Fleet, the Tower, and the Clink. Interestingly, some of London's prisons were privately owned. At that time, running prisons was considered quite a good business. Since people were imprisoned for not very serious crimes in England, as in Italy, a person who had served time in prison did not become an outcast or a pariah. In Britain, as in Italy, most prisoners ended up behind bars because of unpaid debts or taxes. The Fleet prison was specifically built for this category of inmates. There was also an entire system of privileges in place here. For example, the already familiar practice of sending inmates home for the holidays. That's why many prisoners tried to get transferred to the Fleet prison. And later, they remembered it as a pleasant place. However, only those inmates who had money lived so well there. The conditions were completely different in London's Newgate. Robbers, murderers, traitors, and swindlers ended up here. That's why this prison was always overcrowded. The cells were always filled with heavy damp air, which caused everything to be covered in mold, and the prisoners suffered from lung diseases. The prisoners were fed so poorly that cases of poisoning, even fatal ones, were not uncommon. The prison facilities were infested with bedbugs, rats, and other parasites. It's no wonder that epidemics regularly broke out in Newgate, claiming dozens of lives. Conflicts often broke out between inmates in the cells, sometimes resulting in killings. Things were so bad in this prison that it was used to scare other prisoners. But even here, everything was decided by money. In Newgate Prison, there were two sections, one for gentlemen and one for common people. Despite the poor conditions, in some cases, imprisonment in England was also considered a light punishment and was used for the least dangerous criminals. There's another interesting point. By law, the maximum prison term for English criminals was 1 year and 1 day. Sometimes people were imprisoned for longer, but these were extremely rare exceptions. In addition to prisons, there were also special houses for vagrants and beggars in medieval England. Nighttime wanderers also ended up there, because in the Middle Ages, only the guards walked the streets after sunset. It was believed that good people should be sleeping at home at that time of night. In England, not only men were put in prison, but also women and even children. The latter ended up there for theft, although usually young offenders were punished with stocks and the pillory. By the way, women were rarely put in medieval prisons. It was believed that they wouldn't be able to protect themselves from violence by guards and other prisoners. The Tower and the Bastille. When talking about medieval prisons, of course, you can't ignore the two most famous ones, the Tower of London and the Bastille in Paris. You can easily study the history of two countries, France and Great Britain, through them. The founder of the tower is considered to be William the Conqueror. In 1078, he built a huge stone castle on the site of an old Roman fort. Later, the tower was repeatedly expanded and rebuilt. It became a state prison in the 12th century. The first prisoner appeared here in 1190. The first prisoner of the tower whose name has been preserved in history was Bishop Ranulph Flambard. He was the royal treasurer and was imprisoned for embezzlement. The most interesting thing is that he managed to escape from the fortress and even continued his financial activities. Few of the later prisoners were so lucky. Overall, the tower can be called a VIP prison because mostly people of noble origin were imprisoned there, including even members of the royal family. There were not only rebels or traitors here, but also people who somehow fell out of favor with the monarch. For example, the first female prisoner in the tower is considered to be Matilda Fitzwalter, or as she was also called, Fair Maud, who rejected the advances of King John Lackland. The first prisoner of royal blood in the tower is considered to be the Scottish ruler Baliol. Even in prison, he lived quite royally. He had his own horses and a pack of dogs, as well as an entire staff of servants, and all of this was paid for from the British Treasury. But William Wallace, another famous Scot, was much less fortunate within the walls of the tower. He was executed with horrifying cruelty. And yes, this fortress was not only a prison for people convicted of crimes against the state, but also the main execution site in England. Executions were regularly carried out here. But mostly the prisoners of the tower were not foreigners, but British kings. Richard II and Henry VI were held in this fortress. Moreover, the latter was most likely killed here. The sons of Edward IV died mysteriously in the tower. In fact, their burial place was only discovered 100 years later. According to the most common version, Richard III ordered the boys to be suffocated and their bodies to be bricked up under the stairs. Thanks to Shakespeare, the name of Richard III is still considered a synonym for treachery and cruelty today. The tower has always been regarded as a sinister place. Sinister rumors circulated among the English about torture and brutal executions taking place within its walls. Speaking of the medieval period, this was greatly exaggerated. In reality, the tower became a bloody place during the time of the Reformation. However, the story of these events goes beyond the time frame of our narrative. The history of the tower is, of course, incredibly interesting, but it can't be called a prison in the way we usually understand the word. It was a typical royal dungeon where people who had displeased the monarch in some way were thrown. Both the conditions of the prisoner's confinement and the length of time they would spend in the dungeon depended on the monarch's will. The Bastille. The famous Bastille in Paris was built in the middle of the 14th century as a purely defensive structure. The 100 Years' War was underway, and another fortress in Paris was clearly not superfluous. However, very soon it began to be used as a prison as well. Interestingly, the first prisoner of the Bastille was its chief architect, Hugues Aubriot. His detractors accused him of involvement with a Jewish woman and of sacrilege. The architect spent 4 years in the fortress, and only by chance did he manage to get out and gain his freedom. The prison itself was not large. It could hold only 42 inmates. The cells were located in the towers of the fortress. The conditions in the upper rooms were tolerable. The prisoners lived in spacious rooms with small barred windows. But the cells in the basements, which were several meters below the courtyard, were terrible. Hardly any light or air reached them, and the walls were always damp. For centuries, French kings used the Bastille as a place of imprisonment for their enemies and political opponents. Many of them were imprisoned without any trial or investigation. The king would simply write a note ordering a certain person to be sent to the fortress. The French themselves considered the Bastille a very harsh place compared to other prisons. It was a true symbol of autocracy. In the end, this played the main role in the sad fate of the fortress. But that's a completely different story.
Historia.
Instead of an epilogue, imprisonment is one of the main types of punishment nowadays. However, its effectiveness is increasingly being questioned. Most often, prisons are filled with young, energetic people who, instead of doing productive work, simply drain public funds. Such institutions are very expensive to maintain. Worse still, inmates are completely excluded from the economy. They don't buy anything. They don't pay for housing or electricity. They don't pay taxes. Just in the United States alone, there are more than 2 million of them. And mostly they're not rapists or murderers, but drunk drivers, drug dealers, and petty fraudsters. At one time, the appearance of the first prisons was definitely a progressive step, but that was a very long time ago. Today, this type of punishment is clearly becoming obsolete. Will the world of the future be able to do without prisons altogether? Well, hardly. There are plenty of individuals who absolutely need to be kept away from society. That's all.